John had never thought that a simple mistake could lead to such a strange turn of events. He had been part of a team sent to explore an unknown planet in a distant galaxy. The mission had been clear: survey the planet, gather information, and leave. But things quickly went wrong. John was now stranded alone. His team had been wiped out in an unexpected ambush, leaving him the sole survivor. The hostile environment made it impossible to contact anyone. The cold, desolate world was harsh, with no sign of life except for the occasional flash of a distant storm. His survival skills were put to the test. But no matter how hard he tried, every day felt like it might be his last. His rations were low, and his equipment had been damaged during the attack. Lone and struggling, John decided to set up camp for the night. He managed to find a cave to shelter from the intense winds that whipped through the rocky landscape. As he sat near a small fire, his thoughts wandered to his team. They were gone, and he had no way of knowing what had happened to them. A sense of loneliness weighed heavily on him, but he couldn't afford to let it overwhelm him. It was still a chance to survive, and he would take it. It was during one of those dark, cold nights when he saw something that made him pause. In the distance, a faint light flickered, moving across the barren landscape. John squinted, trying to focus on what it could be. It wasn't another ship. It was too small and too erratic. Curiosity, mixed with the hope of finding something or someone alive, led him to investigate. He carefully packed his things and followed the light. As he approached, the light grew brighter, and soon he could make out the shape of a figure. It was a woman, but not a human woman. Her skin was a pale blue, almost shimmering in the dark. She lay on the ground, barely conscious, with her eyes closed. Her body was bruised and her clothes were torn. She looked fragile, like a broken doll. John's heart raced. He had never seen anyone like her. His first instinct was to stay away. This could be dangerous. But as he crouched beside her, he saw that she was barely alive, struggling to breathe. Her chest rose and fell slowly, as though each breath was a battle. Without thinking, John acted. He knew that if he didn't help, she would die. He pulled out his emergency medkit and began to treat her wounds, applying bandages to her cuts and bruises. He couldn't be sure what had happened to her, but it was clear she had been through something terrible. She stirred slightly, her eyes flickering, open for a brief moment. They were a deep, glowing green, strange, yet beautiful. She looked at him for a few seconds, her gaze filled with confusion and fear. Then, as if giving in to the exhaustion, she closed her eyes again. John carefully moved her to a safer spot, covering her with his survival blanket. The cold was unbearable, and he knew she would freeze to death if he didn't act fast. Sitting down beside her, John watched over her, his mind racing. Who was she? What had happened to her? He couldn't make sense of it. But one thing was clear: he couldn't just leave her. The night seemed to stretch on forever as he stayed awake, keeping an eye on the strange woman. He had no idea what species she was or where she came from, but he had a strong feeling that she wasn't from any place he knew. By the time dawn broke, the woman had started to stir again. Her breathing was steadier now, and her wounds seemed to be healing thanks to the care he had given her. Slowly, she opened her eyes and looked at him again, this time with more clarity. "You're human," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. John nodded. "Yes, I'm John. I found you out there. You were hurt." She blinked as though trying to process his words. I'm not sure. ... What happened?" Her voice trailed off, and she seemed to struggle to stay awake. "Rest," John said gently. "You're safe now." Nodded slightly, but before she closed her eyes again, she whispered something that surprised him. "I will never forget you." The words hung in the air, strange and heavy, as though they carried a weight far greater than he could understand. John didn't know what to make of her statement, but the sincerity in her eyes made it clear that it was important. As she drifted off to sleep again, John sat back, feeling a mix of confusion and something else, something he hadn't expected, a strange sense of connection in the hours that followed. He kept a close eye on her, making sure she was stable. He didn't know who she was or where she came from, but one thing was for sure: he wasn't going to leave her behind. She had no one, and neither did he. Somehow, in this lonely, desolate world, their paths had crossed. And for some reason, John felt like he had to protect her. The quiet of the alien planet wrapped around them as John continued to watch over the mysterious woman. It was a strange, unexpected bond that had formed between them, and he couldn't shake the feeling that their meeting was no accident. There was something more to this encounter, something that would change both of their lives forever. As the days passed, John kept a careful watch over the alien woman, whose name he learned was Zira. She had finally regained enough strength to sit up, though she was still weak. The world around them was harsh, but they had managed to find shelter in the cave. The cold winds that howled outside only seemed to grow stronger with each passing night. But inside, it was warmer, more bearable. Zira had been silent for most of the time, recovering from her injuries. John didn't push her to speak, knowing that her mind was probably overwhelmed by everything she had been through. The one thing she had shared with him in her fragile state was the strange, quiet promise that she would never forget him. John didn't fully understand it, but he wasn't ready to question her. After all, what did he really know about this woman? What had brought her to this lonely planet? The days seemed to blur together as they both settled into an uncomfortable routine of survival. John would venture out to gather supplies, searching for food, fresh water, and any useful materials he could find. He'd learned quickly that the planet wasn't entirely barren. It had its dangers, but it also had resources, though they weren't easy to obtain. When he returned, Zira was usually resting, her eyes closed as she tried to regain her strength. On the third day, Zira finally spoke more than just a few words. John had just returned from one of his trips outside the cave when he saw her standing, staring out into the vast emptiness. She was looking at the sky, her gaze distant. For a moment, John thought she was lost in thought. He wasn't sure if she even knew he had come back. "Zira," he called, his voice quiet as he approached. Her. She turned to face him, her eyes soft but filled with sadness. "I miss my people," she said softly, her voice full of sorrow. "I was not supposed to be here. This is not where I belong." John didn't know what to say. He could only imagine what it must feel like to be alone, stranded on a strange world with no way to return home. He had lost his team, but at least he was human, and he knew that Earth would eventually look for him. Zira, on the other hand, had no idea if her people were alive. Her race, her culture, her everything gone. "I'm sorry," John said after a long pause. "But you're not alone anymore. I'm here with you." Zira looked at him, her gaze steady. There was something in her eyes that John couldn't quite place, something that made his heart skip a beat. Was it hope? Was it gratitude? Couldn't say for sure, but the connection between them had grown stronger over these past few days. She wasn't just an alien anymore. She was someone he needed to protect, someone who had become important to him. "Thank you," she whispered, "but I can't stay. I need to find my people." John didn't argue. He knew that, deep down, Zira couldn't stay on this planet forever. She had a purpose, a life waiting for her beyond this place. But the question was, how would they get off this world? And more importantly, what dangers awaited them if they tried to leave? He had a lot of questions. But for now, the most important thing was survival. He had to keep her safe, even if it meant giving up the search for his own way home. Couldn't turn his back on Zira. Over the next few days, Zira became more active. She began to help him gather food, learning quickly how to identify the local plants that were safe to eat. She also told him more about herself. Zira came from a peaceful planet, one that was once thriving with advanced technology and a rich culture. But all of that had been destroyed by a war where she and her people had never been prepared for. They came in the night. Zira explained one evening as they sat by the fire. They attacked without warning, without mercy. People couldn't fight back. We weren't soldiers. We were creators, healers, dreamers. And because of that, we were wiped out. John listened, his heart aching for her. He couldn't imagine the pain she must have felt, seeing everything she had known destroyed in an instant. It was something he had never experienced, and he hoped he would never have to. "I was one of the last to leave," Zira continued, her voice filled with quiet regret. "But I didn't escape unscathed. I barely made it off my planet before it was too late. Now, I don't know where to go. I don't even know if anyone survived." John could see the weight of her words. Her eyes, once full of hope, were now clouded with uncertainty, but there was still a spark of determination in them. Zero wasn't giving up. She couldn't, and neither could John. "I'm going to help you find them," John said firmly. "If we can find a way to get off this planet, we'll look for your people. I promise you that." Zero looked at him, a soft, grateful smile tugging at the corner of her lips. For the first time in days, John saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Thank you, John," she whispered again. "You're the first person to show me kindness since everything fell apart." John smiled back, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since the mission had gone wrong.
There was no going back now.
Zero wasn't just someone he had saved. She was someone he would protect, no matter what. And together, they would find a way to escape this desolate planet and whatever danger lay ahead. The days passed slowly as John and Zira adapted to their new life on the planet. It was a constant struggle, but the two of them managed to make do. They had formed an unspoken bond, one that grew stronger with each passing day. Zira was no longer just a stranger. She was someone John cared for deeply. He would do anything to protect her. Zira had become more active in their daily tasks. John no longer had to gather all the food and supplies by himself. She learned quickly, using her knowledge of plants and the natural environment. Her race, though peaceful, had long understood how to survive in tough conditions. She had even taught John how to build a makeshift shelter using the materials they found. Still, the feeling of isolation never quite left. The vast, empty world around them seemed to swallow up any hope of rescue. John couldn't help but wonder if they would ever make it off this planet. He had been trained to survive in difficult situations, but this one felt different. He was no longer just a soldier trying to make it through. He was responsible for another life. It was on the 10th day when things began to take a turn. The weather had shifted, and the winds had become more violent. A storm was brewing, something that John had learned to watch for. He and Zira had just finished gathering food for the day when the sky darkened unexpectedly. "We need to get inside," now John said, his voice sharp with urgency. Zira looked up at the sky, her eyes narrowing as she saw the approaching storm. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice filled with worry. "Follow me," John replied, quickly leading her back to their shelter. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. As they rushed toward the cave, the first raindrops began to fall. But it wasn't just rain. The storm was unlike anything John had ever seen. The wind howled, the air became thick with swirling dust, and the rain pelted them like small needles. By the time they reached their shelter, the storm was in full force. Inside the cave, they huddled together for warmth, and John tried to reassure Zira. She was visibly shaken, her fear of the unknown clearly written on her face. "It'll pass," John said, though he wasn't entirely sure. The storm was fierce, and it was hard to tell how long it would last as the storm raged outside. The two of them sat in silence. John was trying to calm his own nerves while keeping an eye on Zira. He noticed that she had started to tremble slightly. Her small form curled up next to the fire. It wasn't the cold that was causing her distress, but something deeper. "Zira," John said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "What's wrong?" Zira looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I'm scared," she admitted. Quietly, "This place, this storm, It reminds me of when my world fell apart, when my people were attacked." John's heart sank as he listened to her words. He had seen the sadness in her eyes before, but hearing her voice it out loud made it real. This planet, this storm, it wasn't just a physical threat. It brought back memories of a home she would never return to. "I'm sorry," John said, his voice full of empathy. "But we're safe here. You're safe, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you." Zira didn't say anything for a long while. She just stared at the fire, her eyes distant. The storm raged on, but inside the cave, there was a quiet sense of peace. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. After a while, Zira spoke again, her voice softer this time. I'm starting to believe you. John raised an eyebrow, not sure if he had heard her correctly. Believe me? Zira nodded, her green eyes meeting his. I wasn't sure if I could trust you at first. You're human, and I've only ever known my own kind. But the way you've treated me, the way you've protected me, ... it's different. John smiled gently. You don't have to trust me all at once. I know you've been through a lot. And I'm not asking you to forget everything. Zira took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing a little.
Ouch.
The storm outside was still howling, but inside the cave, there was a calm that settled between them. I know I should be strong, Zira continued, her voice low. But sometimes I feel so lost. Like there's no point in going on. John reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. It was an awkward gesture, but it felt right. You don't have to do this alone. I'm here. And as long as I'm here, we'll figure it out together. For the first time, Zira smiled faintly. It wasn't a big smile, but it was enough. Enough to give John hope. As the storm continued to rage outside, John realized that, despite all the danger and uncertainty, something had changed between him and Zira. It was no longer just about survival. It was about the bond they had formed. In the middle of this chaos, they were no longer just two strangers from different worlds. They were two survivors, learning to trust each other in a hostile universe. The storm raged through the night, but inside their small shelter, John and Zira sat side by side, watching the fire flicker in the darkness. They had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, John felt a glimmer of hope. The days following the storm were filled with a sense of uneasy calm. The winds had finally died down, but the storm had left its mark on the planet. The once clear skies were now filled with dark clouds, and the air felt heavy. John and Zira had spent the last few days in their shelter, waiting for the planet to settle. But neither of them could ignore the growing sense of urgency that had taken root in John's mind. Zira had recovered a little from the storm. Her strength was returning, but she still carried the weight of her past with her. She had become more quiet in the days that followed, often staring into the distance, lost in thought. John could tell that the memories of her destroyed homeworld haunted her, but he couldn't force her to talk about it. She would speak when she was ready. One morning, as the sun rose weakly over the horizon, John decided that it was time to take action. He couldn't sit in this cave forever. Zira needed to find her people, and John needed to find a way off this planet. We need to move, John said as he packed his gear. I've been thinking, and I believe there's a station not far from here. If we can get there, we might be able to contact someone, maybe even get off this planet. Zira, who had been sitting near the fire, looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. And what if we don't find anything? She asked, quietly. What if we're just wandering in the dark? John's heart sank. He understood her fear. This planet was a desolate place, and it felt as if no one would ever come for them, but he couldn't let himself give up. Not yet, not when Zira was counting on him. We won't know unless we try, he said firmly. We have to at least. Make the effort. You can't give up hope, Zira sighed, her shoulders slumping in resignation. After a moment, she nodded slowly. I'll go with you, she said, her voice soft but determined. I don't know if there's anyone left, but I owe it to my people to try. John gave her a small smile. We'll stick together. We'll make it. And so, the two of them set out, leaving their shelter behind. They moved through the rocky landscape, carefully avoiding the dangerous wildlife that roamed the planet. The air was thin and dry, making each step feel like a struggle. But they pressed on. Determined to reach the station, the journey was long and exhausting. The landscape around them was stark, filled with sharp cliffs and barren plains. There were no signs of life, no comforting sounds of birds or animals, just the wind and the dust that blew across their path. Despite the bleak surroundings, John kept a watchful eye on Zira, making sure she was staying strong. She had moments of weakness, but she refused to let it show. She would push forward one step at a time, determined to reach her goal. At one point, Zira stumbled, her foot catching on a loose rock. She fell to the ground with a soft cry, and John rushed to her side. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Zira shook her head, brushing off the dust from her clothes. "I'm fine," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. I haven't had to do it for so long." John helped her to her feet, offering her his arm for support. "You're doing great." Take it slow." They continued on, their pace a little slower now, but still steady. As they walked, Zero spoke more about her past, her people, and her homeworld. John listened, not interrupting, letting her share whatever she needed to say. "They were peaceful people," Zero explained, her voice distant. "We believed in harmony, in creating things that would benefit everyone. But the war, it changed everything, tore us apart. It was one of the lucky ones. But even now, I feel the weight of everything we lost." John nodded, understanding her pain. He had lost his team, his comrades, but he had never experienced the kind of loss that Zira had. Her people were gone, and she didn't even know if anyone was left. "You're not alone," John said softly. "You've got me, and I won't let you lose hope." Zira glanced up at him, her green eyes meeting his. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I would have done without you." They walked for hours, the sun slowly sinking lower in the sky. As the day wore on, the landscape began to change. The barren rocks gave way to more rugged terrain, and in the distance, John could see the faint outline of a structure. It was small, but it looked like the kind of place they might be able to find some answers. "We're getting close," John said, a sense of excitement building in his chest. Zira looked up, her eyes bright with cautious hope. "Do you think we'll find someone?" "I don't know," John replied, "but we have to try." As they neared the structure, they realized it was an old outpost, long abandoned. The building was in poor condition, but it still seemed sturdy enough to offer shelter. They carefully approached the entrance, and John checked around, making sure there were no immediate threats. "We'll rest here for the night," John said. "Tomorrow, we'll see if we can get it working. Maybe there's something inside that can help us." Zira nodded, grateful for the chance to rest. As they entered the outpost, she took a deep breath, her expression uncertain but hopeful. "We'll find a way," John said, more to reassure himself than to comfort her. "Together, we'll find a way." The outpost they had found was nothing, like what John had expected. The building was small, weathered by time and the harsh conditions of the planet. It was clear that no one had been here for a long time. Still, it offered them shelter for the night, and for that John was thankful. Inside the structure, the air was thick with dust. The walls were cracked, and the once bright paint had faded to a dull gray. Despite the damage, there were signs that it had once been a busy place. Shelves lined the walls, though most of them were now empty or broken. The only thing that seemed to remain was a small control panel, its buttons dimly lit, waiting to be activated. John knelt down beside the panel, his fingers tracing the old buttons. "I think we might be able to get this working," he said, more to himself than to Zira. "It's not much, but it's a start." Zira stood behind him, watching quietly. Her face, though still marked with sadness, held a glimmer of hope. "Do you think it will work?" she asked, her voice cautious. "There's only one way to find out," John replied with a smile, though it was a small one. He wasn't sure what he was going to find, but he had to try. They needed answers, and this was their best chance. He pressed one of the buttons, and to his surprise, the screen flickered to life. It was old, but the basic functions were still active. Static filled the air, followed by the faint sound of a voice, but it was too distorted to understand. John fiddled with the controls, adjusting the frequency, trying to clear up the signal. For a moment, nothing changed. Then slowly, the voice became clearer, though still broken and garbled. It sounded like a transmission, but it wasn't in any language John recognized. "Zira, do you understand this?" he asked, turning to her. Zira leaned over, her eyes scanning the screen. "It's not my language," she said softly, shaking her head. "But it sounds like ... a distress signal." John's heart skipped a beat. A distress signal. It could mean help someone else had been on this planet, or at least near it. This was the first real sign of life they had found in weeks. He adjusted the controls again, this time trying to amplify the signal. It wasn't much, but it was something. The voice grew clearer, though still distorted. John could barely make out a few words, but they were enough to give him a sense of direction. "It's a ship," he said, excitement in his voice. "Someone's out there." Zira stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the screen. "How far?" she asked, her voice full of urgency. John traced the coordinates on the map that appeared on the screen. "Not far," he said, his fingers pointing to a location on the far side of the planet. "It's close." Zira's expression softened. For the first time in days, there was a spark of hope in her eyes. "We can go there," she said quietly. "We can find them." John looked at her, a smile tugging at his lips. "Yes, we can. We just need to get to that ship." The two of them spent the next few hours gathering their things, preparing for the journey. The storm had passed, but the harsh conditions of the planet remained. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they had no choice. This was their best chance, and they weren't going to waste it. By morning, they are on their way, following the coordinates from the outpost. The path was treacherous, filled with rocky terrain and steep cliffs. Zira moved with purpose, though she was clearly still weak from the storm. John stayed close, offering her his support when needed. Despite the difficulties, they made steady progress. As they walked, they spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts. John couldn't help but wonder what awaited them at the ship. It'd be another empty hope, like the outpost. Or would they finally find the help they so desperately needed? The day was long, and the sun was setting when they finally saw it. In the distance, a silhouette appeared against the horizon. A large ship, though damaged, sat on the rocky surface of the planet. It was not a sleek, high-tech vessel like John had imagined. Instead, it was a battered, weathered ship, as if it had been through many battles and survived. "That's it," John said, pointing toward the ship. "That's our way off this planet." Zira's eyes widened, a mix of awe and hope filling her expression. It's real. After all this time, it's real." They hurried toward the ship, the last stretch of their journey filled with a new sense of determination. As they reached the ship, John noticed that it was abandoned. There were no signs of life, but the ship seemed intact, its engines still, warm as if it had only just landed. John approached cautiously, his hand on the side of the ship. He could feel the vibrations of the engines beneath his fingers. "It's still functional," he said, a sense of relief washing over him. "We can use this." Zira walked up beside him, her eyes scanning the ship. She didn't speak for a moment, but then she turned to John, her voice filled with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. "I never thought I would find hope again. You gave me that." John smiled at her, feeling a sense of pride. He had done something he never thought possible. He had given Zira hope when she had none. And now, together, they had found a way to escape. "We're not done yet," John said, "but we'll make it. We've come this far." Zira nodded, her eyes shining with tears. "Yes, we will." Together, they stepped into the ship, ready to face whatever came next. They didn't know where the ship would take them or what dangers awaited them. But for the first time since they had met, they felt like they had a chance to survive, a chance to find peace. The inside of the ship was quiet, but there was a sense of hope in the air. John and Zira had found the ship they had been searching for, but now they had to figure out how to use it. The door had been partially damaged, but after a few attempts, John managed to open it. Inside, the ship was dark, but it was still functional. There was power, though it seemed low. John's hands moved quickly as he checked the controls. The technology was different from anything he had ever seen, but it wasn't impossible to figure out. He had been trained in basic ship mechanics, and this ship, while alien, shared some similarities with Earth's technology. Zira stood by him, watching closely but not interfering. She seemed unsure of how to help, but was still eager to learn. "We need to find a way to start the engines," John said, his voice focused as he examined the ship's control panel. Zira stepped closer, her eyes scanning the buttons and levers. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked, her voice soft. John looked up at her, meeting her gaze. "Just keep an eye on the systems for me. If anything goes wrong, let me know." Zira nodded, and for the next few minutes they worked together in silence. John felt a strange sense of calm as he went through the motions of starting the ship. Zira, though still unsure about everything, watched him carefully, her eyes full of curiosity. John could tell that she was trying to make sense of the unfamiliar technology. It wasn't easy, but she was trying, and that was all he could ask. Finally, after what felt like hours, there was a soft hum as the ship's systems powered up. The lights flickered on, and a low, steady thrum filled the air. John let out a sigh of relief. "We're in business," he muttered to himself. Zira's face lit up with a smile. "It's working," she said, her voice filled with excitement. John grinned back at her. "Yes, it is." With the engines now running, the next task was getting the ship off the ground. John sat at the pilot's seat, his fingers moving over the controls. Zira moved to the seat beside him, looking over his shoulder. "I've never been in a ship like this," she said, her voice full of wonder. "This technology, it's so advanced." John nodded as he adjusted the flight settings. "It's definitely different from anything I've seen, but I think we can handle it." Zira looked out the window, her eyes scanning the horizon. "I've been to many worlds, but none of them felt like home. This one feels like the end of everything I've known." John paused, looking at her. "We're not at the end. We're starting a new chapter together." Zira turned to him, her eyes soft. "I don't know what I would have done without you." John smiled, his focus on the controls. "We've come this far. We're not stopping now." With that, he gently pushed the throttle forward. The ship trembled slightly as it began to lift off the ground. Slowly at first, but then more steadily as the ship ascended into the sky. The planet's surface became smaller beneath them, the rocky landscape shrinking away until it was just a distant patch on the horizon. The feeling of lifting off the ground, finally escaping the barren planet, was like a weight lifting from John's shoulders. For the first time in days, he felt free. He glanced at Zira, who was staring out the window, her eyes wide with awe. "I've never been this high up before," she said quietly. "It's beautiful." John looked out at the stars, his heart racing. "It is," he agreed. "We're free." But even as the ship climbed higher, John couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The ship was moving smoothly, but the systems seemed to be running low on power faster than expected. He glanced at the readout on the control panel, noticing the battery level dropping. "Zira," John said, his voice steady but serious. "We need to find a way to conserve power. The systems are running low faster than I thought." Zira quickly turned toward him, her face serious. "What do we do?" John thought for a moment. "We can shut down non-essential systems. We'll help save power for the engines." Zira nodded, and the two of them worked together again, adjusting the ship's settings. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best they could do for now. The ship slowed down slightly, but it was still moving, still heading away from the planet and toward whatever was out there. The next few hours were tense. John kept a close eye on the systems, monitoring the power levels and trying to keep the ship on course. Zira, though still unfamiliar with the ship's technology, did her best to assist him. She was learning quickly, and John found himself impressed by her ability to adapt as the stars outside the window grew brighter. John couldn't help but think about what they had accomplished. They had found a way off the planet, and they were headed into the unknown. He didn't know where the ship would take them, or if they would find any other survivors. But he knew one thing for sure. They weren't alone anymore. They had each other. Eventually, the ship stabilized, and the power level seemed to hold steady. John let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They were on their way, and for the first time since they had met, he felt a true sense of relief. "Where are we going?" Zira asked, her voice filled with uncertainty but also hope. John looked out at the endless expanse of space. "Wherever we need to go. We'll figure it out." Zira nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, John, for everything." John smiled, feeling the warmth of her words settle in his chest. "We're in this together, always," as the ship sailed Through the vastness of space, John and Zira sat side by side, ready for whatever lay ahead. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, they both believed that they could face it together. The silence of space was both calming and unsettling. John sat at the pilot's seat, his eyes scanning the controls of the ship. The engine was still running smoothly, but the sense of unease in the back of his mind wouldn't go away. Zira, sitting beside him, stared out the window, her gaze fixed on the endless stars. For the first time in days, the ship was quiet. No storm to fight against, no dangerous creatures to avoid, just the vast, silent void of space. Been comforting, but instead it only made John feel more isolated. They were on their own now, far from the planet they had left behind. "How long until we reach that station?" Zira asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft but steady, as if she, too, felt the weight of the emptiness around them. John checked the navigation system. "A few more hours, I think. We should be there by morning." Zira nodded, though her expression was distant. John could tell she was thinking about her home world again, the memories of everything she had lost. He wished he could say something to make her feel better, but the words didn't come. Instead, he just stayed focused on the controls, his fingers moving over the ship's panels. It wasn't long before they both fell into a quiet routine. Zira would sit beside him, looking out into the stars, while John kept the ship on course. They didn't speak much, but there was a sense of understanding between them now. They didn't need words to know what the other was feeling. They had both experienced loss, and they were both searching for something to hold on to. As the hours passed, John's thoughts turned to the future. They didn't know what they would find when they reached the station. Would there be other survivors? Would there be anyone who could help them? Or would they find an empty outpost, like the one they had abandoned? He didn't want to think about it, but the fear gnawed at him. He had promised Zira that they would find a way off this planet, that they would find her people. But the truth was, he didn't know if he could keep that promise. What if they were too late? What if there was no one left? "John," Zira's voice interrupted his thoughts. "You're quiet? Is something wrong?" He glanced at her, startled by her question. Zira's eyes were gentle, filled with concern. She had always been strong, even when she had every reason to give up. But now, he could see that she was still carrying the weight of everything that had happened. He didn't want to add to her burden, but the truth was that he wasn't sure where they were going or what would happen next. "I'm just thinking," John said, forcing a smile. "I've never been this far from home. I don't know what we'll find when we get there." Zira nodded, her gaze returning to the stars. "I understand. I don't know what's left of my people either, but I still have to try. I owe them that much." John watched her, admiring her determination. Despite everything she had been through, despite all the pain and loss, Zira still believed there was something worth fighting for. It was a strength John didn't fully understand. It made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "We'll find them," John said, his voice more confident than he felt. "We'll figure this out, Zira. Together." Zira smiled at him, her expression softening. "I believe you." The ship moved through the stars, the journey growing quieter as the hours passed. John kept his attention on the controls, but his mind kept drifting back to Zira. She had come so far, and yet she still carried the weight of her past with her. It wasn't something she spoke about often, but John knew it was there, hidden behind her quiet strength. He wanted to say more to her, to tell her that she wasn't alone, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he focused on the ship, making sure everything was still running smoothly as the hours stretched into the early morning. Zira eventually leaned back in her seat, her eyes closing as she tried to rest. John watched her, his heart heavy with the knowledge that her journey was far from over. They had only just begun, and there was so much uncertainty ahead. But he had made a promise to her, and he intended to keep it. "Hang in there, John," muttered to himself, though he knew Zira couldn't hear him. He couldn't let her down, not now, not when she had already been through so much. A few hours later, the faint glow of a station appeared on the ship's radar. It was small, but it was a station nonetheless, a sign that they weren't completely alone in the vastness of space. John's heart quickened as he adjusted the ship's course, heading toward the station. "We're almost there," he said, his voice filled with a mix of excitement and fear. "Zira, we're almost there." Zira stirred in her seat, opening her eyes and looking at him. Is it... Is it the station?" John nodded. "Yeah, we'll be there in a few minutes." Zira's face softened, a small smile forming on her lips. "I never thought I'd see this day. After everything... After losing everything, I never thought there would be a way out." John reached over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone anymore. We'll make it through this." The ship neared the station. John's thoughts were consumed by what might lie ahead. He didn't know what to expect, but one thing was certain: he and Zira were in this together, and no matter what, he would keep his promise. The station loomed ahead, a small beacon of hope in the endless darkness of space. As they approached, John's grip tightened on the controls. The next chapter of their journey was about to begin, and he was ready to face it, whatever it might bring.